Yeah. The curiosity is super important, and it's scary to be curious, to be
Mm,
honest, because um, our brains thrive on going into a situation and being able to predict, right? And
yes.
so, and Buddhist philosophy talks about this, like um, a, a lot of the ways that we misperceive situations are actually based on things that make sense from a survival
Yeah.
instinct, which is, our nervous system is really good at recognizing patterns, right? So, what you could see makes a lot of sense if you're being, hunted in plains by saber-toothed tigers, right?
Yeah.
You would really need to know, like, okay, I can pick up the pattern of that sound and I
Hmm.
know that that's a saber-toothed tiger, right? Just from the sound, right?
Yeah.
But you can also see that then that can cause you to misperceive, and it also causes you to not be curious about things that you don't perceive as a direct threat to your safety, and also not be curious about things you do perceive as a direct threat to your safety because you're so busy being like, how do I get away from this, right?
Yeah.
So that ability to say, maybe there's no pattern here. I just have to like actually listen and
Yeah.
ask.
Welcome to the Soulful Sound Podcast, where you will find conscious, inspiring content to support your healing and transformation. Now, before we jump into today's episode, I want to extend a heartfelt invitation for you to be part of our community where more insightful conversations await to guide you to heal, grow, and thrive. Simply click the subscribe button. It means the world to me. Your support, your comments, everything is truly incredible. And we're only at the beginning of this awesome journey together. I'm so excited to be on this adventure with you, and your subscription is a valuable part of making it all happen. Thank you so much for joining, sending you love, healing, and sound wherever you are. Welcome back, everyone, to our latest episode on the Soulful Sound podcast. I'm joined by the awesome Ethan Nichtern, who is the author of Confidence, Holding Your Seat Through Life's 8 Worldly Winds, and several other titles, including the widely acclaimed The Road Home, a contemporary exploration of the Buddhist path. A renowned contemporary Buddhist teacher and the host of the Road Home podcast, Ethan has offered meditation and Buddhist psychology classes at conferences, meditation centers, yoga studios, and universities, including Brown, Yale, NYU. And he has been featured by CNN, NPR, the New York Times, Vogue, the Business Insider, whoa, 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 and written for the Huffington Post, and so much more. What a beautiful, beautiful introduction. Welcome, Ethan, to the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me, Simone. It's great to be with you.
So wonderful. Oh, well, I'm so excited to talk about your book. And before we jump into that, I do want to ask a little bit about your personal story. What got you into the work that you're doing today that, and of course, then led you to write about the book, what you wrote about?
Yeah, yeah. So thank you so much. I grew up in New York City, and as I just found out that you spent a few formative childhood years in Queens,
Yes,
so
yes, that's
I'm
right.
about I'm about a kilometer or so from Queens right now.
All
So
right.
so
My old
I'm
neighborhood.
your
Of
old neighborhood. Well, Queens is huge, so it might be
course it is. Yeah, of
it might be
course.
a ways from your formative neighborhood.
True, true.
Um, But my parents were creative people. My father's a musician and composer. My mother was a artist who also had a catering business. Later, she became a psychotherapist. But they were also, so I grew up in New York City, but they were also students of a man named Chogyam Trungpa, who is probably the foremost, definitely in Tibetan Buddhism, but one of the foremost Buddhist teachers to come to the modern Western world.
Mm.
And they had studied with him since before I was born. So I grew up, I had a mother from small town Arkansas, a New York Jewish father, but they were both Buddhists. And so I was kind of surrounded by that in my otherwise, postmodern, cosmopolitan, trying to be progressive childhood. So, and then in high school and college, I got a lot more into well, first reading about Buddhism and then eventually, meditation, which is always hard. It's, rarely are people really, I mean, people find it very useful, but rarely do people get into it. And then, it just became an increasing interest and the application of Buddhist thought to a wide array of different topics, Western psychology and neuroscience, arts, activism, social justice, just sort of how ancient contemplative traditions that really focus on the mind and working with reality can influence a lot of other fields of thought has always been my interest. So I've been teaching for, over 20 years now. And yeah, I've written different books. I wrote an overview, from a contemporary perspective on Buddhism. And this book, Confidence, I think some people who write in the spiritual space, I've actually heard this from an agent that, like, when you get known as a sort of spiritual author, you kind of figure out what works and you find little ways to write the same book over and over again. And I really didn't want to do that. So I've tried to make all four of the books that I've written about contemporary Buddhism new and different. And the topic of this one came, I work with lots of people individually on their path and their mind and their practice. I work with groups quite a lot, courses and retreats. And pretty much every conversation, when we dug a little bit under the surface of, just an interest in mindfulness or an interest in stress reduction, confidence was a really big issue. And, struggling with confidence has been an issue in my own life. So I really wanted to unpack it, see there's not a clear place in ancient Buddhist thought where confidence and self-confidence is talked about. There are a lot of themes. So I really want to unpack that, bring that together with personal experience, bring that together with a few themes in, Western psychology and neuroscience, and also from a kind of world facing and, how the world works and why some of us have confidence and why some of us don't. I was just really interested in that topic of confidence. And to be honest, I mean, I do think I stumbled onto something whenever I describe one of my books. I usually, like, when I'm talking to somebody about it, I usually have to get a certain way into it before they're like, "Oh, I get it. Yeah, I could read that." This one I get, like, I just say the word confidence and
Right.
people are like, "Oh, I need to read that."
Yeah, yeah. Well, I love, looking at your work. I love how practical you use the word contemporary Buddhism, and I really love how practical you get and really down to earth into the nitty-gritty of things in your writing and your way of navigating life's ups and downs, which is amazing. But your book is Confidence, but it's also referring to, you said, holding your seat through life's 8 worldly winds. Now, while confidence is definitely, I know what that's about, what is
Right.
holding your seat through life's earthly winds? So let's talk about, you can talk about either side first. What does holding the seat mean, or the 8 earthly winds, however feels right for you? Because I'm sure a lot of
Yeah.
people want to know.
Yeah, yeah. So, yeah, the subtitle "Holding Your Seat Through Life's Eight Worldly Winds" is requires a little bit more
Yeah.
explaining context, and that's what the book is about. But
Yeah.
this metaphor of holding your seat. So in the mindfulness meditation instructions that I received first within the Shambhala and Tibetan Tantric Buddhist tradition, and for people who are unfamiliar with that, one of the biggest teachers in that tradition is Pema Chodron, if people are familiar with her work. The metaphor for arranging your posture to do a sitting meditation session is called taking your seat, and it's not taking your seat as in the way you might, like, when you're frustrated with your child, you might say, just sit down,
Yeah.
It's more a feeling. There's just some practical anchoring of, like, the arrangement of the posture and the spine and, actually bringing our nervous system into balance. And that's the sort of practical element of taking your seat. But then there's also a metaphor, which is, really arriving and claiming one's spot on the earth with a sense of I belong here. In fact, the way it was taught in the Shambhala tradition, Shambhala comes from this mythology in Himalayan and Tibetan culture of sort of like a lost city of Atlantis or a utopian society. So it was often taught like, take your seat as if you are the leader of an enlightened society, assuming your seat on the throne, right? So it was a really regal, like super confident metaphor being unpacked. And so I'm not into monarchy personally. No offense to the Brits, but
Yes.
that is one thing that fascinates. We don't have to talk about this, but one thing that fascinates me is American media's obsession with the British royal family, which always fascinates me because our country was specifically started out of disdain, not just for monarchy, but for that specific group of people. But we are obsessed with y'all's monarchy, and it
Well,
amazes
isn't
me.
it interesting that even pulling from that as a metaphor, how human nature sometimes is to be obsessed with those things that we disdain or
Right,
that don't necessarily serve us. So actually, you brought a beautiful
right.
little message through that anyway.
Yeah, yeah, but at the same time, everybody wants to be a king or a queen, and like that metaphor survives every
That's
Democrat,
right.
like
Yes.
Beyonce, King LeBron James, the king of basketball, so
Right.
there is this sort of we definitely take those metaphors, even if,
Sure bet.
you know,
Yeah.
in this country we're really trying to hold on to democracy right now, fingers crossed. Um, but yeah, so there's this sense of kind of arriving and claiming one spot. There's a feeling of like,
Mm.
this is my spot on earth, and I'm not gonna. A lot of times people think meditation is about disappearing, right? Transcending, like going elsewhere. And I talk about that sort of confused notion in the book's introduction. And the idea here is it's really about showing up. I'm on the earth, I'm a human. I deserve to be here. I'm accountable to being here. Let me show up and be present. And so that's the notion of taking your seat. And then the sort of classic, but I don't know if you know this about Buddhism, but they excelled at creating lists for people to, and a lot of that is because it's an oral tradition. It predated written language, but there's also this sense of when one is contemplating to actually memorize a list of qualities or a list of teachings so you could recall them in your
Yes.
life. And so one of the earliest Buddhist lists is called the Eight Worldly Winds, right? And this is really what the whole first half of the book unpacks in modern terms. These are the experiences that when we try to show up to life hit us just like the wind, and knock us around. And from experiences like just pleasure and pain to the way we seek praise and fear criticism. Whenever you put something out on the internet, you're hoping people don't criticize it, right? There's a huge array of criticism one can receive in putting anything on the internet these days. Um, and just our desire for success and failure. And the metaphor of this is being like wind. So you've taken your seat on the earth. You're trying to work with yourself. You're trying to say, I can show up. I can be here. And then you're chasing something you hope for, and you're fearing something that's going to cut you down. And these forces are just constantly striking us. And so hold your seat is a metaphor that comes from take your seat.
Mhm.
Hold your seat is a metaphor for when it gets very windy, can you actually not be unaffected? Because I don't think that's, in my experience, is not possible to be unaffected
Yeah,
by
of
what
course.
happens to us. But can you stay rooted and work with what's happening? And, kind of, I think my father says that his teacher used to say a lot, don't panic. I mean, we've all had panic attacks in some form or another, but that basic attitude of, I can work with this, you
Yeah.
know? Okay,
Mm.
I just lost my job. I can work with it. I just had a really difficult thought. I can work with it. And it's interesting also because sometimes when we get what we want is when we lose our seat.
Mhm.
I
Mhm.
mean, you fall in love and like just forget about everything, right? And there's a sense of losing your seat in that. So
Yeah.
taking one seat and holding one seat are they're specific and practical when we're practicing sitting meditation, but sitting meditation is really meant to be a metaphor for how we are working with our heart and mind throughout the day and our life in the world.
Yeah, that's really beautiful. And I'm glad you kind of spoke about the, both sides of the coin, because I did want to ask about that. Some of when you spoke about the 8 wins, you spoke about the success or failure or the pain and pleasure, both sides of the same coin, if you like. And most people would say, yeah, I want to go towards pleasure or go towards success and not feel the pain or not feel the failure, or experience the failure. But yes, we experience them all. So in that holding the seat metaphor, how can you talk more about showing up in the pain and the failure just as much as you show up in the success and the pleasure? Can you speak a bit to that?
Yeah. I mean, it's very hard, right? Because I mean, it's if you look at pleasure and pain, that's just our nervous system at play,
Yeah.
right? There we've inherited through generations, through many generations, through our evolution, through our social and cultural experience, just this relationship where pain feels good. I mean, sorry, pleasure feels good, pain feels bad. And there's no, I think a lot of times people are trying to find spiritual methodologies where it's like, I don't feel pain anymore, you know?
Mm.
Oh, yeah, no, I'm unaffected by pleasure. And it's like, well, I've been meditating for, 25, almost 30 years really now. And pleasure still feels really good. You put a chocolate chip cookie in front of me, the mind is going to do a thing,
Yeah.
I just had to have a root canal yesterday, right? And it wasn't too bad, but when they're grinding on your teeth like that, even if you are slightly numb, it's like I don't like this,
Yeah.
I do not like this. There's like just a little person in you that goes me no likey. And I think if we were completely enlightened, those voices would still be there, but there's a little bit more space to accommodate the
Mhm.
full range. And that holding your seat is what I'm equating to sort of developing confidence, right? And
Yeah.
because if you look up confidence in the dictionary, it means the most common definition is firm trust, right? So
Mm.
self-confidence is firm trust in oneself, right? But what are we really trusting? We're not trusting our ability to kill it every time that we, do something. We're trusting our ability to be present and to deal with whatever experience comes our way. That's really whether we succeed or fail, we're trusting that.
Yeah.
And so I think, I think a lot of times people are looking for spirituality where they become less affected. I really think the traditions that I've inherited and what has been the most useful to me are the traditions that help us become more sensitive to experience.
Mhm.
So not just more sensitive in that we're always, getting knocked around by the experience, but more sensitive and also more resilient. And I talk about, maybe I could just talk about one example because
Sure.
I've always been fascinated by this about the effects on the brain, specifically related to pain, physical pain, that mindfulness meditation has. So there's probably the leading neuroscientist who studied meditation in depth and specifically Buddhist meditation. He's also a Buddhist practitioner. He's named Dr. Richie Davidson, and he's at the University of Wisconsin, Madison. So he and his team conducted an experiment of different people who had meditated for a certain number of hours, right? And there were complete novices who were kind of the control group. There were more experienced meditators, and then there was one master meditator, which was a Tibetan Lama who's very popular in the West, named Mingyur Rinpoche, who wrote a really amazing memoir called "In Love with the World" that I would
Mm.
recommend people check out about basically wandering in India for 3 years in modern times,
Mm.
and leaving his monastery behind. So anyway, I refer to Mingyur Rinpoche in my book as the Jedi of mindfulness. And so the way they set up this pain experiment to see how different levels of mindfulness shifted our relationship with pain is they set up a situation where you would receive a burning sensation, like from these metal plates that they could heat and cool very quickly. So it would, while it was on you, while the pain was actually happening, it would deliver a really, really intense pain, but it would be safe. It wouldn't cause damage to the skin. As soon as the experiment was over, they could cool it off, right? So the way they set up this experiment was in 30-second intervals, and they measured the activity in the pain receptors in the brain. So at second zero, you're told soon you're going to have a painful experience, basically, but it doesn't start yet. Right. It only starts 10 seconds in and only lasts for the middle 10 seconds of this 30 seconds. So at 10 seconds in, the pain actually starts, the sensation actually starts, and then it ends 20 seconds in. But they keep measuring after the fact the pain receptor activity for 10 more seconds, right? So there's the anticipation, there's the actual experience, and there's after the experience. So novice meditators, basically what happened is they had 30 seconds of the painful experience in their pain receptors. In other words, as soon as they were told this is going to hurt, the pain receptor activity went up. It went up more, slightly more, during the painful experience, and then it came down slightly after the pain stopped. But really the rumination, the what the hell just happened to me? Why did I sign up for this experiment? Kept the pain receptor active, right? So I saw a lecture where Richie Davidson was with Mingyur Rinpoche, and they were talking about this. And Richie Davidson said that when it got to Mingyur Rinpoche's reaction in his pain receptors, that Dr. Davidson was initially surprised by the results. But it felt kind of intuitive if you understand being present with an experience, which is that he was told, okay, soon you're going to experience a painful experience, and very little change in the anticipatory 10 seconds, right? Almost nothing happened to Mingyur Rinpoche. And after the fact, after it was done, very little reaction in his pain receptors. But this is the question I always ask people about, holding your seat with pleasure and pain. What do you think happened for a master meditator while the painful experience was going on in his pain receptors in that activity? I mean, you may have looked at the book, so you may know already.
No, I don't actually. I did not read that piece, but I would like to think that he felt it because he was very present with it. You spoke about the sense of being sensitive, but not necessarily more than everybody else, but certainly not numb to it. I'd like to think the experience was still there.
Yeah, yeah. The experience was still there, and actually, during the painful experience, the master meditator's pain receptors spiked higher than the control group.
They spiked higher. Okay.
So he felt it. So he didn't feel it before, and he didn't feel it after. So in other words, he had a more intense experience, but only while it was happening, right?
Yes.
So there was and he was fairly present with that experience. There wasn't a lot of, I believe, like, why is this happening to me? Oh my God, this is unfair. The thoughts we might think in a similar. He was just like, okay, this is what's happening, and I'm really feeling it, right? So this is not the way we think of meditation a lot of times. I like if the Calm app, ran an advertising campaign that said, feel pain more. Like, that's just not the way to get people to meditate. But they didn't do the flip experiment, but I imagine it would have been pretty similar, which is what happens, you put a chocolate chip cookie or whatever your favorite dessert is in front of somebody. And I imagine that you would actually taste the cookie more, and you would actually harvest more pleasure from that experience as well, right? So increased presence means there's an increased array of experiences that we're holding our seat. And some of those, in each of these 8 worldly winds, which are these 4 pairs, there's a hoped for outcome, which in this case is pleasure, and there's a feared outcome, which is pain. But if you can imagine, oh, I can appreciate the full array a little bit more, you can't imagine why that would be like, oh, I can handle my experience. Because so much in life of our insecurity is, I'm not going to be able to handle pain, you know?
Yeah, yeah,
And what if this pleasure leaves, you know?
yeah.
And
And
so,
would I choose to have more pleasure and also more pain, or do I want to
right.
kind of stay on this level where they're both quite, I don't know, subdued, perhaps the way we might do from time to time in our lives?
Yeah, yeah, exactly. So we do have this choice of saying, I'm going to stay sort of numb to the whole range
Yeah,
of experience. But I also think we're not really numb because on our deepest level, we are aware of what's happening to us. That's
for
part of the
sure.
premise of Buddhist thoughts about the nature of the mind is awareness is lying under,
Yeah.
whatever our habitual reaction or acquired numbness is. And so on a certain point, we're experiencing everything totally anyway. And once you accept that you can't avoid the winds of the world, you can't avoid feeling hope and fear,
Yes.
then your approach to them changes, and you say, "How
Yeah.
can I actually be with this? How can I hold my seat with this?"
Yeah, that's beautiful. I mean, it's interesting because I feel like there's a very, I suppose, common expression or example of that. So first of all, my experience in meditation, I grew up with a metaphysical mother and very spiritual background. And I started learning to meditate from age 6, so over 40 years,
Wow.
I guess, of meditation now. I wouldn't call myself a master or anything in that way. I just have my own practice where I feel very comfortable in a seated practice, lying practice, sonic practice of meditation.
Wonderful.
But the reason I wanted to say that is because I am a mother. And when women are giving birth and we're going through labor, there is the anticipation because you know that everyone knows that in order to give birth to a child, you're going to have labor pains. For some, it's really, really bad. And for others, it's not so much, depending on your body and all the different conditions. But we have the anticipation of it. For me, it was like, especially when you don't know the extent to which the pain would be, you're just like, well, this is what the body's made for. We do it. So on and so forth. But during my labor pains, which were excruciating, especially for my first and second child, that because of my one meditation practice, I believe, but also I come from a musical background. So breathing was a very big part of my practice. So going to breath and going to through a calming of my nervous system so that I felt the pain more, which really felt like really being present with it, I think is what got me through it the way I did. So as you're
Hmm.
speaking about it, so I didn't think about that practice, I mean, that experience in that way, but it totally makes sense to me I feel every moment of this because the more present I am and the more I can connect to my breath, the easier the experience was. And then, of course, the joy at the end of the experience, the reward of having this beautiful soul was like next to nothing. So it's just an very interesting way of looking at it.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, thank you for that. I mean, yeah, it's interesting. Obviously, I've never given birth, but I was, in the room when my daughter's mother gave birth, right? And
Wow,
and
yeah.
she described a fairly similar experience to what you're describing. But I wonder if part of that, because it is excruciating, right?
Yeah,
I mean, it's
it
kind
is.
of insane what's happening from the standpoint of pain, right there.
Yes.
It's like your body's a transformer, basically. Um, but it's also viewed as very natural,
Yeah.
right? So there, your mind and heart are able to go into the experience taking this view. Whatever happens here, I mean, obviously, you want the health of the baby. Things could go wrong with the health of the baby or the health of the
Sure.
mother, but the basic process is this is supposed to be happening. This is
Yes.
worth happening. This is a beautiful thing. This is the most human thing. So whatever happens, I want to be present with it. And then you
Yeah.
use techniques, that are very similar to, any kind of
Yeah.
mindfulness meditation to stay with it, to be, moving through it. So that shift in what we would call the view, right? To be
Yes.
like, actually, this pain is worthy and it's not supposed to not be here, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's it. I mean, to me, it describes a lot of what you were just saying, because you did speak about that changing the view or the perspective when you realize that, you can't avoid these things. And that deepening of awareness is where you get the most from all things in life.
Right.
Yeah. So I do have a question then in terms of kind of using the metaphor of meditation, how we're coming back to confidence, how that relates to showing up confidently in relationships or work or just socializing in the world. How does that impact everything in that way?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because, again, I think there's two ways to look at meditation, I think, basically. One is escaping from the world, and I talk about right after I graduated university in 2000, I always try to make at least one reference to Radiohead song in each of my books. That's just one rule I have. So I was talking about the song How to Disappear Completely, which was on their album Kid A, where the refrain, almost like a mantra, is Tom York saying again and again, I'm not here, this isn't happening, right?
Mhm.
Again and again and again. And it gets more and more hollow and ethereal as the song goes on. And I think a lot of times people think about meditation, right, in that. Like, and the Buddha, to be honest, the historical Buddha really kind of took that view of like, I need to get away from the world. And so
Mhm.
I think if we take the view that our meditation or any aspect of our spiritual practice is like, the world is dirty because of all these things happen to me there, all of these winds. It's very windy, it's very overwhelming. Therefore, I want to get away from it to have a spiritual experience. Then we're not really going to have a lot of confidence when we re engage with the world. But I think if we take the view that our meditation practice is preparation for the world, and
Mhm.
every aspect of the meditation should actually mimic the way, in an isolated space, because we're not talking to people, we're not writing emails, we're not, recording podcasts when we
Yeah.
meditate, but in every way, the meditation space should mimic the way we're trying to hold our heart and mind when we're in the world. Then you start to say, like, okay, what would it mean to take my seat in a difficult conversation? What would it mean
Yeah.
to show up fully there and be present and open my heart and track what I'm feeling and try to speak truthfully? What would it mean to actually show up? And I think, at that point, the question of confidence becomes, shifts into like a question of like, what does it mean to actually inhabit one's power? To actually really,
Mm.
that's why I love that, monarch on their throne metaphor for taking one seat, even though
Yeah.
democratic socialism is probably the thing I agree with the most. Is because there's a sense of like, oh, I want to inhabit this with power
Yeah.
and loving power, compassionate power, but like, okay, how can I be present, and
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, that's it. And actually that's a beautiful segue into my follow-up question because you write in the book about cultivating compassion, whether that's self-compassion or for others, and you speak about it as this foundation for genuine confidence. So can you speak more about that, the self-compassion and why it's important and how does it help us navigate when these winds come in?
Yeah. So the second half of the book is I go through a list that is kind of my list. It's coming from different places. It's definitely themes that are all in historical Buddhism, but the four powers of confidence, right? So what do we actually cultivate to help us hold our seat more? And the first of those is compassion, right? And it's interesting. I was just talking about this, that the reason I want to talk about compassion in a book about confidence is if confidence is really about showing up to our life, showing up to difficult situations, and confidence is also often related to like wanting to accomplish something. Like that's where confidence gets hard is when we're trying to succeed at something or make progress in something and we say, I don't know if I can do this, right? And what tends to happen in those moments, I think, is our lens gets really myopic, because you're just worried about like, what do they think of me? When are they going to write me back? Is this going to go well, etc. And we kind of lose that context of human care and empathy, right? So, a lot of times I think two things that I think need to be overcome is one, we often look at compassion as a moral imperative. In other words, it's something we should feel, you know? And it's interesting because a lot of people these days in the world are being like, compassion's stupid, it's for weak people, you know?
Yeah.
That has nothing to do with success, right? And there's really, I mean, there's really a strong movement in the world. Like we could, you know, we could frame it in so many different ways, but from a spiritual standpoint, it's basically an anti-compassion movement. You know, when there's a movement towards individualism or patriarchy or white supremacy, that's really all of those things are just actually movements away from feeling in relationship to oneself and other.
Yeah.
And so it's a view, it's an individualistic view of power, right? And I think compassion gives us a more contextual view of power. But so it's not a moral imperative. It's actually an experience that when you have, I mean, you know, similar to the childbirth story, it's like if you have this experience, you want to have more of it, right? Which is a very different way of looking at compassion than saying like, oh, I should care about others.
Yeah.
It's more like if you hold your heart and mind for moments in this balance where you are tending to self and tending to others, you actually feel happier and you would want that experience more and you would want that experience for others more,
Yeah.
right? So I think that's, you know, rather than moralizing about it, actually framing it as a psychological or spiritual experience that we actually want to cultivate is the way to go. And then the other part of that is that this view is compassion is about other people, you know, and I think that's tricky, especially people who get into, you know, mindfulness, who get into lots of different forms of spirituality. A lot of folks who get into it are already doing service work, you know,
Yeah.
or their parents, and they often get into it just to have a break or have some tools because they feel like I'm already serving, you know, so many other people that I just need to figure out how to survive the service to others that I'm doing. So
Yeah.
I think it's important not to think about compassion as outward pointing towards others, but it is also inward pointing, right?
Yeah.
And it's, I mean, and there's Western psychologists who've taken Buddhist thought. I'm thinking of somebody like Kristen Neff, to really focus on the need to generate self-compassion, you know?
Yeah. That's
But
beautiful.
yeah, yeah. I think the first part of compassion is empathy, right? Which is just is not compassion yet, but it's one of the components of compassion. It's and I talk about three qualities of compassion related to Tibetan compassion meditation in the book. But empathy is just the ability to imagine what somebody is feeling, you know? So self-compassion really starts with those moments, and I have like a funny little dialogue with myself in the book where it's on a day where I feel like I have 17 things to do and I feel overwhelmed and resentful. Uh, you know, self-empathy is just like actually having a dialogue with yourself, like, how am I? How am I
Mhm.
feeling? You know? And empathizing with others' experience is a little bit more imaginative because you either have to ask them
Yeah.
and then feel into what they say from your own subjective experience, or you have to say, you know, what would that feel like?
Mhm.
You know, what would it feel like to lose a child in a war zone? I don't know what that feels like. So you have to like imagine
Yeah.
based on piecing together some experiences you can feel. But that imagination, I think, that willingness to imagine is really important. And I think we have to start by inquiring, like, how am I doing? You know?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, there's so many beautiful nuggets in that. And I definitely resonate with the inside out approach. You know, I would say that I very much tended to be, and I still consciously very much work with that self-compassion, self-love, self-worth, self-everything, because I thrive so much being in service to others, as you mentioned. So I remember I mean, it's many years ago, I've been working with this where anytime I went into a place where I noticed that my service felt like, I'm emptying myself, and not empty from a Buddhist perspective, but feeling
Yeah.
drained of energy or things
Drained.
like
Yeah.
this, I would question, I'm like, okay, so I understand here's what's happening. I'm giving of my energy to others and not necessarily filling my cup up. And one of the things that my mom always said to us, and it always comes back to me, is that the best way is not about seeing the cup as half full. It's actually having an overflowing cup so that you give from the overflow and your cup remains full. So that has always been my approach to navigating those moments where I feel like I am of service, but I don't always give myself what I offer others. It's like, what would me being full look like? So there's one piece. The second thing is you mentioned curiosity, which I think is a really beautiful piece in that framework, because you want to be able to be open, as you said, and curious enough to even ask and inquire or imagine somebody else's experience in whatever way, shape, or form. So that's a really beautiful word that I don't often hear described in this way when it comes to compassion and empathy. So I just wanted to kind of draw that out a little bit. That's really beautiful.
Yeah. 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 The curiosity is super important, and it's scary to be curious, to be
Mm,
honest, because um, our brains thrive on going into a situation and being able to predict, right? And
yeah.
and so, and Buddhist philosophy talks about this, like a, a lot of the ways that we misperceive situations are actually based on things that make sense from a survival
Yeah.
instinct, which is, our nervous system is really good at recognizing patterns, right? So, what you could see makes a lot of sense if you're being, hunted in plains by saber-toothed tigers, right?
Yeah.
You would really need to know, like, okay, I can pick up the pattern of that sound, and I
Hmm.
know that that's a saber-toothed tiger, right? Just from the sound, right?
Yeah.
But you can also see that then that can cause you to misperceive, and it also causes you to not be curious about things that you don't perceive as a direct threat to your safety, and also not be curious about things you do perceive as a direct threat to your safety because you're so busy being like, how do I get away from this, right?
Yeah.
So that ability to say, maybe there's no pattern here, I just have to like actually listen and
Yeah.
ask,
Yeah.
and I mean, I think that's another thing that I've learned through my contemplative practices and therapy, and all of these ways that we inquire into ourselves.
Hmm.
It's scary to know you don't know yourself, you know? Like, I'm 45 years old. Maybe I have no idea how I'm feeling right now,
Hmm.
or maybe I've been making certain assumptions out of non-empathy, non-curiosity, out of how I'm feeling. Never mind all the people who live in, my city or my town, like
Yeah.
just me, like, oh shit, I don't know myself. And then you add labels like I'm supposed to be an expert at knowing the
Right.
mind. But actually, to know oneself is to realize we're living in a changing reality all the time, right? So the only way to know anything is to inquire, actually, right?
Yeah.
To be curious,
To
because
be
you only know it
curious.
for that moment.
Yeah, that's it. As if things evolve and shift, it's not linear, right? It's
Yeah.
beautiful. And I think that coming to the survival mode, as you say, it's very often that we go into these old patterns. I often like to see it as an experiment. When people say, well, how do I know that this, or how do I know that meditation is going to help me do this or that? And it's like, well, you don't. But if you're
Yeah.
not curious, or if you don't explore, experiment, you won't know, right? It will
Yeah.
only be from that perception of whatever, thoughts, patterns, and so on you've been influenced by. So I do like that. You mentioned really early on, and I just want to come back to it right at the start, that meditation can be hard.
Oh, yeah.
Right. Okay. So could we speak a bit about that? What do you think is most hard about it for people, for yourself, if you'd like? And then perhaps on the flip side, what are one or two things that we can do to navigate those winds that feel, tricky in those moments?
Yeah. Yeah. I think, I think. there's a lot of things that can be hard. I think one thing that makes it hard is that people feel like and I think this is kind of the one that I've heard the most often and sort of timelessly over my teaching career and practicing career, is people think that they should be able to reduce or change the activity of thought, right? So, because many meditation techniques set up this seeming structure where presence with whatever the experience is, the mantra or the breath or the imagery, if you're doing a visualization meditation, that is defined as doing it right,
Yeah.
and thinking is defined as doing it wrong, right? And so I think we need to just say, like, um, and it's said that when one starts a meditation practice, one of the metaphors in classic Buddhism for the early stages of meditation, and not the early stages of one's meditation career, but the early stages of like a meditation retreat, or
Mhm.
the early stages of just sitting down to practice in life when you're in New York or in London and you're inundated with so many human relationships. You sit down to practice, and they say it's like a waterfall of thoughts, you
Mhm.
know? And they actually say that that's the experience of a master meditator too. Maybe the master meditator can quell it more quickly and work with it more skillfully, but we don't really want to stand under the waterfall of our own mind. It's not, it doesn't feel soothing. It's like, it's like waterfall with dirt and rocks hitting us and ow, it hurts. Give me just a little bit of space. And so I think it's hard because we're really facing something that's a lot more messy and a lot and very beautiful, but also a lot more chaotic than we want it to be, and
Yeah.
I think just allowing space for like, oh, my mind's going to be chaotic, um and it's really about the awareness to work with that. So I think the assumption that we're supposed to be able to still our mind,
Yeah.
and that might not be what progress actually is with meditation, that progress might actually be creating space around the erratic or chaotic notion, experience
Mhm.
of thoughts and perceptions and emotions, um, that it feels disappointing to people. Even
Yeah.
even though I found that actually working with meditation, I mean, it's utterly game changing,
Yeah.
utterly
For
game
sure.
changing. But if you look at, like, if you were charting thoughts across a session, if you could do that experiment, it might not change from session one to uh, session 100. But I
Mhm.
guarantee if you did 100 sessions of really any form of meditation that's based on presence and kindness towards oneself, there's many different techniques, but let's just
Sure.
say mindfulness of the breath meditation, because that's a very central technique. If you did 100 sessions of that for 10 minutes, I guarantee you would say, I'm less reactive,
Mhm.
I'm tasting my food more. I can listen just a little bit better most of the time when I'm not feeling triggered by the crazy relative in front of me or whoever it is.
Yeah.
That's it. Yeah, yeah. If you want to know how enlightened Ethan Nichtern is, just record him on the playground with his 7-year-old daughter. That would be the test for me. So if I'm not frustrated with Izzy, but generally speaking, I think we find huge, huge outcomes of doing meditation, but you would not find those outcomes because your mind had stopped being itself.
Yeah. Yeah. I think I'm so glad you pointed that out because that is one of the things that I often say with my children, for example. I remembered one of my sons said when he was younger and he was doing his own meditation practice and just sitting and just allowing. He said, what's really interesting but also annoying is that I can hear my thoughts more. Right. And I just thought, good. You said, and now you can just allow them to be. It's not about getting rid of your thoughts, like you said, clearing your mind. It's blank. There's nothing but crickets. It's
Right.
noticing, but not being impacted by them or affected by them in the same way. And I think that was a really beautiful expression of it's okay for your thoughts to be present. You're just not holding on to them. That's not the focus in those
Yeah.
moments.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think from a creativity standpoint, right, we want to hear our thoughts more. I mean, I get it. Like, it's like, oh, if you expected it to be quiet, right,
Yeah.
and then it was loud, you'd be like, oh, this isn't what I wanted. This isn't what I expected. But like, if your son or anyone else says, oh, I'm going to, make art, or I'm going to make music, or, I'm going to start, an organization, or something like that, you actually want to be able to hear your own thoughts to
That's
do
it.
that. So,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. And I do think, if you went on a longer retreat, just because of the perceptual apparatus and the intervening stimuli of being, in our family life, in our communal life, in our work life, when you're in those spaces, the mind is more sped up.
Mhm.
It's moving faster. It's perceiving more. It's looking at screens. It's checking for information. If if a person did like a week-long meditation retreat, I guarantee by the end of that retreat, when you return to the world, you would feel like your mind was definitely moving slower than the people's around you. Like,
For
but you
sure.
would be with it, so there would still be activity, there'd still be presence, but it with more practice, it does slow down. But I actually think how speedy the mind is, if there is a variable that affects it, it's really more related to the stimuli that we are receiving from the world. So,
Yeah. Yeah.
and those are what I'm defining as the winds, or what
Yeah.
Buddhism is defining as the winds. Like, if you're in life, it's going to be windy, right? Because
Yes, of course.
relationships, everything creates that. Yeah.
So we just need to know if, am I putting on a thick coat or a little jacket, but the winds are going
Yeah.
to come anyway.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, I think yeah, I mean, that's another way of looking at it, that the more we work with our mind, the more we become like a meteorologist.
Yeah,
It's like,
that's it.
okay, looks like this weather pattern is coming in. How do I work with that? Right? What are my tools for working with that? Right? But you
Yeah.
don't, I mean, we do get mad when it's raining, which is,
Yeah.
I don't know,
Only
do
when you
do
have to go
Londoners?
out in it, though. I love the rain from indoors.
I'm
Yeah.
talking to a Londoner, so like,
No,
yeah,
that's right.
everybody.
Yeah, but I mean, I love that the meteorologist because I use this term a lot and I can't remember where I first heard it, but it's really about being the thermostat, not the thermometer.
Right, right, right.
Yeah, that's
Yeah,
beautiful.
I love
Now,
that.
I know that we've got a bit of time left, but there's this question that I really want to ask you because it's not something that I'm just curious. So in your book, you talk about the importance of lineage and connecting the ancestral lineages and wisdom. And I want to know about that in terms of the piece about belonging and, claiming our lineage, especially when you talk about confidence. So how do we claim our lineage when it comes to confidence? Can you speak to that some more?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, we may have a very clear lineage spiritually. Certain spiritual lineages have a really clear, like, these were my teachers and these were their teachers, and this is the name of the lineage and tradition, and I am a holder of that lineage. So,
Yes.
a lot of Eastern thought, a lot of indigenous thought has that kind of clearly, like, this is my lineage, this is who I come from. And there's a lot of power in that, right? There's because, and then I think sometimes as modern Westerners, when we look at the past, we look at all the ways that it was, messed up.
Mhm.
I could use an R-rated version of that. Effed up, right? And
Yeah.
a lot of times it can undercut our confidence, because whatever came before, when you look at everything as messed up, is not there to support you. It's like, if you thought all of humanity before you was just a bunch of neurotic, selfish, confused morons, then you're just going to be inhabiting that same apparatus. And so when you go to try to take your seat and hold your seat, you're not going to feel that inherent power and strength, right? But
Mhm.
I think, and I talk about contemplating one's lineage, the complexity often of one's lineage, because people can, ancestors or lineage figures can hold wisdom and hold great confusion. And I talk about that in my own experience, both the Buddhist lineages that I've been part of, family lineages, etc. But to actually tune into, okay, what are the wisdom streams that I've received? Can I call upon those beings that have inhabited that lineage, in my heart, in my mind? Can I call upon my ancestral lineage, my family lineages, my cultural lineage, the lineages of whatever work I'm trying to do in the world, the heroic figures in that? Can I actually ask them to be with me? Then we feel like the past actually, rather than feeling like the past is, we're like screaming into the wind that's blowing against us, it's actually tailwind. It's actually supporting us. And
Yeah.
so I think it's tricky because, a lot of times I think, especially with Eastern thought, there is a lot of discussion of co-opting, ancient wisdom, co-opting Eastern wisdom or indigenous wisdom. And I think that's a very important discussion, but, also, feel like, well, people who are of Tibetan heritage or other heritages, asked me to teach. So I don't feel like I'm particularly co-opting. But if I forget where these lineages are coming from, and if I don't give credit and I don't call on all of that, then I would feel like I'm co-opting. That's the point where, meditation just becomes stress relief, or yoga just becomes, going to the gym,
Right.
when we don't have this sense of heritage, and actually this is a wisdom stream coming through me. And also I think it's really, like I talk about my own grandmother Claire, who is in the dedication of the book, and I talk in the conclusion of the book about an example of doing a hard thing, which is, I grew up in New York City. I'm 45 years old. I didn't get my driver's license, which is, when people grow up in New York City, they sometimes don't get it, when other people in the States do, in their teen years. But we usually get it like by the time we're 25. And I've traveled so much in my life, but I failed the test when I was 17. And I just got terrified of it. I didn't have enough practice, and I just kept putting it off and finding ways not to do it, not to do it, not to do it. And I could always get by. But I was like, okay, if I'm writing a book called Confidence, as I'm writing the book, I have to do this.
Mhm.
So when I was, and it's actually hard to learn to drive in New York City. It's much harder than if you're in a small town somewhere. But when I went to practice driving and so forth, and especially when I went to the test, the lineage figure I thought of was my grandmother, who was a total badass and had tremendous confidence and tremendous complexity to her, but she also got her driver's license late in life, right? So I
Mhm.
was like, this, I can actually call on her energy to be like, can you
Yeah.
support me through my, and also doing compassion meditations towards my 17-year-old terrified self who had failed the test and then never done it again.
Mhm.
But I think calling on my grandmother in that case, that's actually, like, we don't do that enough.
Yeah.
And I do think that's why it's important, even if there's complexity around the tradition that we're inheriting, if we are practicing any form of meditative wisdom or spiritual wisdom, especially if it comes from a cultural heritage that's different from our own. But even if it comes, the only reason I'm saying if it's different from our own is when it comes from our own cultural heritage, we usually are already feeling very connected to the lineage and
Yes, of
ancestry then.
course. Yeah.
So, to really know who were the progenitors of this lineage, and there might be some complexity. For example, Buddhism throughout Asian history is overly masculinized. It's overly patriarchal, which is weird because Tibetan Buddhism has a lot of meditative forms where the feminine, the divine feminine is exalted actually,
Yes.
but almost all of the lineage holders in Tibetan Buddhism were men, right?
Mhm.
But with some really notable exceptions. But so your lineage may be complicated. There may be members of the lineage you didn't like, right? There may be members of your own family, you didn't like, but actually saying, I exist in this lineage and I'm going to call on that support and call on that strength. Um, I think in the West we often forget, and I think in, other cultures and indigenous cultures they don't forget
Yeah,
how
yeah,
to really make that like a show of strength. I think it's especially true in the United States. I mean, Europe at least has a longer history. The United States has a relatively short history, and even we don't want to. That's a huge part of the problem in the United States right now is we don't want to look at our history accurately, and that's, make America great again. It's like, well, that's a myth.
Yeah, I think that's really important. I think what I'm really pulling from that is to have reverence for the sacred wisdom from whether it's our elders, our traditions, our ancestors, all the things that you've said, and whoever holds in your influence and mind and being the beautiful wisdom and power, whoever that is, and bringing that energy, that representation of it into the space to support you. I think this is so beautiful. And I work a lot with that in my own shamanic practices and sound healing. So I completely resonate with it. And I think it's amazing that you are talking about that a lot in the book as well.
Thank you so much.
Well, look, Nick, Ethan, this has been amazing. I'm saying Nichtern. Ethan, this has been wonderful, and I'm just so grateful for the work that you're doing in the world. I just want to say thank you and really celebrate everything that you're doing to help people navigate the winds, the ups and downs, and with confidence, because that piece is so important as we move through the ups and downs in the world, for sure.
Thank you so much, Simone. It's really great to be here with you. I'm honored. I'm honored to be on your podcast.
Thank you so much. Honored to have you. And I have one final question for you, and that is, what is your soulful sound to the world, a prayer or desire that you wish upon the world right now?
Yeah, I think I'd like to form it in the structure of a Buddhist aspiration, just on the spot, related to what we're talking about. So, may all beings, especially those of us listening, take our seat fully on the earth, and may we experience genuine confidence, and may that genuine confidence benefit all beings.
Hmm. Aho, beautiful. Thank you again, Ethan, for being with us today.
Thank
You have a
you.
great rest of your day. We'll see you soon.
Thank you, Simone.
Thanks so much for tuning in. Your support, your comments, and everything is truly incredible. And we're only at the beginning of this awesome journey together. If you love this episode, hit that like and subscribe button and make sure to check out our other episodes. Thanks so much for being with us today. Sending you love, healing, and sound wherever you are.